Before we begin, I need you to understand something fundamental about the story we are about to tell. This is not merely a story about a street drug or a tale of crime and punishment or a simple chronicle of addiction. It is, at its heart, a ghost story. It is a story about the ghost of pain and the human obsession with silencing it. It is a narrative about how the quest for a miracle cure, a substance that was scientifically designed to be the savior of modern medicine, became the architect of a global tragedy. It is a story of how a single molecule reshaped empires, funded wars, destroyed millions of families, and altered the course of human history. The substance we discuss tonight was once bottled in beautiful amber glass, labeled with elegant typography, and sold in corner pharmacies as a safe remedy for children with coughs. It was called the heroic drug. We know it now by a darker name. Before you settle in, take a moment to leave the worries of the day behind. Let the notifications on your screen fade into the background. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and let the stillness of the room surround you. Put the phone away. Silence the distractions. Close your eyes if you wish. Let us begin. In the beginning, long before the sterile laboratories of the 19th century or the dark alleys of the modern metropolis, there was simply a flower. Our story begins not in a city, but in the fertile, sun-baked mud of the Neolithic age. Imagine a landscape of rolling hills and river valleys in what is now Switzerland and Spain, where archaeologists have unearthed the fossilized remains of poppy cakes dating back to the 4th millennium BC. But to truly understand the soul of this flower, we must travel to the cradle of civilization, to the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, under the relentless sun of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians cultivated a delicate plant with paper-thin petals ranging from white to purple. They called it hul-gil. In their ancient tongue, this translated to the joy plant. It is a deceptively simple organism, the Papaver somnifera, the sleep-bringing poppy. When the petals fall, they leave behind a round, green seed pod. If one were to take a sharp blade and gently score the skin of this pod, not too deep, just enough to break the surface, a milky white sap would bleed out. As the sun warms the pod, this sap dries into a sticky, dark brown gum. This gum contained the secrets of the gods. It contained the power to suspend time, to erase hunger, and to separate the soul from the burden of the body. The Sumerians passed this knowledge to the Assyrians, who passed it to the Babylonians, who in turn whispered the secret to the Egyptians. Imagine the bustling markets of Thebes in 1500 BC. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and river mud. In the hands of the priesthood and the healers lay the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence. Within its scrolls, the poppy is prescribed as a sedative. It was used to stop the crying of children, a practice that would echo with terrifying symmetry thousands of years later in Victorian England. The Egyptians traded this dark gum across the Mediterranean in small, jug-like vessels called bilbils, shaped to resemble the poppy capsule itself. The ancient world did not fear the poppy. They revered it. In Greece, it was associated with Hypnos, the god of sleep, and his son Morpheus, the shaper of dreams, and Thanatos, the god of death. The Greeks understood the duality that modern science would later forget, that the difference between sleep and death is often just a matter of dosage. In the Odyssey, Homer speaks of Nepenthe, a drug of forgetfulness that Helen of Troy casts into wine to banish grief and anger. It was the poppy that allowed the ancient mind to cope with the brutality of existence. As the centuries drifted by, the knowledge of the poppy spread along the Silk Road. It traveled in the saddlebags of Arab traders, moving east toward Persia, India, and eventually China. By the time of the Roman Empire, the physician Galen, whose word was medical law for over 1,000 years, prescribed opium for everything from vertigo to deafness. He wrote of its ability to resist poison and venomous bites, and perhaps most importantly, to cure melancholy. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, was known to take a daily dose of the gum to cope with the stresses of ruling an empire on the brink of chaos. He lived in a gentle haze, a buffer between the stoic mind and the barbarian world. But the world moves on, and stories evolve. For centuries, opium was consumed as a raw plant, a tea, or a pill. It was potent, yes, but it was bound by the limitations of nature. But then, something changed. The world would never be the same after the alchemists and the early chemists began to tinker with the fundamental building blocks of matter. The second chapter of our story takes us to the Renaissance, a time of awakening and danger. Enter Paracelsus, the Swiss-German physician who wandered Europe in the 1500s, burning ancient texts and proclaiming that nature was a pharmacy waiting to be unlocked. He took the raw opium gum and dissolved it in alcohol, creating a tincture he called laudanum. The name was derived from the Latin laudere, meaning to praise. And praise it they did. Laudanum was cheaper than gin and cheaper than beer. It became the aspirin of the pre-industrial world. It was a staple in every household, a dark liquid in a glass bottle that sat on the mantel, ready to soothe a toothache, a fever, or a broken heart. By the 1800s, Europe and America were awash in opium. But this was the era of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. Men of science were no longer content with raw plants. They wanted to find the active soul within the material. In 1804, in a small laboratory in Paderborn, Germany, a young pharmacist's apprentice named Friedrich Serturner did something that had never been done before. He dissolved opium in acid, neutralized it with ammonia, and precipitated out white, bitter crystals. He had isolated the active alkaloid of the poppy. He tested these crystals on stray dogs and then on himself. The effect was 10 times more potent than raw opium. He named the substance after the Greek god of dreams, Morpheus. He called it morphine. This was a watershed moment in human history. For the first time, humanity had extracted the pure essence of euphoria and pain relief from nature. It was hailed as a miracle, but miracles often come with a shadow. The shadow deepened with the invention of a new tool. In 1853, a Scottish physician named Alexander Wood developed the hypodermic syringe. The medical community believed that if morphine were injected directly into the blood, bypassing the stomach, it would not lead to the appetite or addiction that opium eaters suffered. They were tragically, catastrophically wrong. The needle did not bypass addiction. It accelerated it. It delivered the god of dreams directly to the brain in seconds. This new technology met its perfect match in the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, shattered by cannon fire and the lead mini ball, were treated with liberal doses of injectable morphine. They survived their wounds, but they returned home carrying a new burden. It was called the soldier's disease. A generation of men, the backbone of the industrial workforce, found themselves enslaved to the glass syringe. But the chemists were not finished. They believed they could engineer the problems out of the plant. They believed they could create a version of morphine that retained the pain-killing properties but eliminated the addictive side effects. This brings us to the year 1897 and a laboratory in Wuppertal, Germany, owned by the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company. A chemist named Felix Hoffmann was tasked with acetylating morphine, boiling it with acetic anhydride, to make it more stable. He produced a substance that was chemically known as diacetylmorphine. When the workers at Bayer tested it, they reported a sensation of immense power, a feeling of being heroic. And so in 1898, Bayer launched their new flagship product. They named it Heroin. It is difficult for us, looking back through the lens of history, to comprehend the initial reception of this drug. It was not sold in back alleys. It was advertised in medical journals. It was marketed as a non-addictive substitute for morphine. It was prescribed for coughs, for bronchitis, for tuberculosis, and asthma. There were advertisements featuring children reaching for the bottle with mothers looking on approvingly. It was the wonder drug of the turn of the century. Doctors prescribed it to patients trying to break their morphine addiction, unaware that they were treating a fire with gasoline. For over a decade, heroin was the gold standard of respiratory medicine. But beneath the polished veneer of the pharmacy counter, a crisis was quietly brewing. What happened next would shock the world and reshape the relationship between the government and the individual. By 1910, the reports began to trickle in. They did not come from the battlefields, but from the emergency rooms of New York and Philadelphia. The cure was creating a new kind of patient. These were not just the soldiers or the wealthy eccentrics. These were teenagers, factory workers, and housewives. The admissions to hospitals for drug psychosis began to climb. The medical community, initially defensive, began to realize the scale of their error. Diacetylmorphine broke down into morphine in the body, but it crossed the blood-brain barrier faster, hitting the central nervous system with a rush that was unparalleled in nature. In 1914, the United States passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. This was the turning point. For the first time, the non-medical use of opiates was effectively criminalized. Doctors who maintained addicts on maintenance doses were arrested. The clinics were closed. This moment, the criminalization of the substance, birthed a new era. When the legal doors closed, the underground windows opened. The trade moved from the pharmacist to the gangster. In the 1920s and 30s, figures like Arnold Rothstein and later Lucky Luciano saw the economic potential of a product that its customers physically needed to survive. The price of heroin skyrocketed. The purity fluctuated. The user, once a patient, became a criminal. As we move into the darkness of the mid-20th century, we see the geopolitical map being redrawn by the poppy. World War II disrupted the trade routes, but the post-war era saw the rise of the French Connection. Opium grown in Turkey was transported to the laboratories of Marseille, France, where Corsican chemists, mastering the art of refinement, turned the raw gum into high-grade white powder. This powder flowed across the Atlantic into the jazz clubs of Harlem and the tenements of the Bronx. It was here, in the shadow of the skyscrapers, that the demographic of the user shifted. It became a drug of the marginalized, a balm for the pain of poverty and systemic exclusion. We see the rise of the junkie archetype in literature and film, the hollowed-out figure haunting the urban landscape. But the crisis was about to go global in a way no one expected. During the Vietnam War, thousands of young American conscripts found themselves in the jungles of Southeast Asia, surrounded by cheap, high-purity heroin flowing from the Golden Triangle, the lawless border region of Laos, Thailand, and Burma. It was reported that in some units up to 15% of soldiers were using heroin. It was cheap, it was pure, and it smoked away the terror of the jungle. When these soldiers returned home, the government panicked. They feared a wave of addiction that would overwhelm the nation, while many veterans left the drug behind when they left the war. A testament to the environmental nature of addiction. The flow of heroin from the Golden Triangle did not stop. It found new markets. As we approach the modern age, the 1970s and 80s, the story of heroin takes on a gritty urban texture. New York City in the 1970s became the epicenter. We see the tragedy of Needle Park. We see the cultural reflection of this darkness in the music of the Velvet Underground and the punk rock explosion. The drug was romanticized by some as a symbol of rebellion, a rejection of the sanitized suburban dream. But the reality was far from romantic. It was a reality of abscesses, of hepatitis, of overdoses in public restrooms. Then, in the 1990s, a strange cultural phenomenon occurred. High-purity heroin from Colombia began to enter the market, allowing users to snort or smoke the drug rather than inject it. This lowered the barrier to entry. Suddenly, heroin was no longer just for the hardcore addict. It entered the fashion world. The heroin chick aesthetic dominated the runways. Pale skin, dark circles, emaciated frames. It was a macabre celebration of wasting away. Musicians, artists, and actors fell to the drug. The death of Kurt Cobain, though complex, cast a long shadow over the decade, highlighting the relationship between artistic sensitivity and the desire for numbness. But while the cameras focused on the celebrities, a far more insidious shift was happening in the quiet towns of the Rust Belt and Appalachia. This brings us to the contemporary period, a chapter that is still being written today. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the pharmaceutical industry introduced a new generation of opioids. They were marketed, much like heroin had been a century earlier, as non-addictive miracles for pain. OxyContin and Vicodin flooded the market. A new generation of Americans became dependent on opioids, not through a dealer on a street corner, but through a prescription pad. When the government finally cracked down on the pill mills and the prescriptions ran dry, millions of people were left with a physical dependence that their bodies demanded be fed. They turned to the streets. The cartels were ready. They flooded the market with cheap, potent heroin to fill the void left by the pharmaceuticals. The demographic shifted again. The user was now the grandmother with back pain, the high school football player with a knee injury, the construction worker. And then, the final tragic twist of our current era, fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin. It began to appear in the supply, often mixed in without the user's knowledge. The margin for error disappeared. The ghost of the poppy had been replaced by a ghost in the machine, a chemical synthesized in labs that required no sunlight, no fields, no seasons. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of the poppy. We are living through a crisis that claims tens of thousands of lives every year. It is a crisis of despair, of economic hollowing, and of a healthcare system that too often treats the symptom rather than the soul. Science continues to search for answers, studying the receptors in the brain, looking for non-addictive painkillers, trying to undo the knot that nature and chemistry have tied. As we reflect on this long, winding history, we are left with a profound sense of irony. The Sumerians called it the joy plant. The Victorians called it God's own medicine. We call it a scourge. But the plant itself has no moral agency. The Papaver somnifera simply grows. It waits in the soil for the sun. It produces its sap as it has for millions of years. The story of heroin is not really about a plant. It is a mirror reflecting our own fragilities. It reveals our desperate need to escape pain, our hubris in thinking we can outsmart nature, and the tragic consequences when commerce overrides compassion. The fields of Afghanistan and the Golden Triangle still bloom with white and purple flowers. The wind still blows through the petals. The chemistry of the brain remains wired for relief. The story continues, flowing like a river through time, carrying with it the wreckage of the past and the hope for a wiser future. As the night deepens around you and the silence settles in, remember that history is not just a record of what happened. It is a reminder of who we are. We are creatures of pain, yes, but also creatures of immense resilience. We have walked through the valley of the shadow of this flower for 6,000 years. And though the shadow is long, the dawn always returns. Let your mind drift now from the history books, from the dates and the names. Let the story fade into the velvet quiet of the night. The past is fixed, but the present is yours to rest in. Sleep well.